Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Flora's Dare by Ysabeau S. Wilce. This is the sequel to Flora Segunda, which I reviewed previously. I will put the link somewhere on the page. Now, I don't want to waste too much time talking about that book because that's not what I'm reviewing here, but I do think I need to give you at least a bit of an overview for you to understand what I'm talking about with this one. So Flora Segunda introduces us to Flora, the youngest child of a very important military family in the city-state named Khalifa. Her mother is the right hand of the warlord and basically the highest ranked person in the entire military. Her father is a retired soldier who is dealing with severe trauma from being captured and tortured by the Hutzels, who I'm going to call by their nickname, the Birdies, throughout the rest of this review because I don't trust my pronunciation. Now, the Birdies are Khalifa's traditional enemy, and since Khalifa lost the last war, they now have sovereignty over Khalifa, and Khalifa only maintains any form of self-rule on their goodwill. And that all makes this book seem a lot more serious than it actually is. Ultimately, Flora Segunda is a fun, voicey book about a 14-year-old girl learning to fight for what she wants and deal with the consequences. And what she wants is primarily to do less chores and to not be forced to go to military school. Now, Flora's Dare picks up not long after the first book ends. Flora's dad is beginning to recover from being a mad drunk shut-in, and Flora very quickly learns that that is a double-edged sword. She no longer has to take care of everything around the house herself, but her poppy, it turns out, is a much more exacting parent than she had expected. Suddenly, she has someone who will actually check to make sure she's doing her chores correctly. She has more lessons, and she has a parent who's going to notice if she misses her curfew, which she finds exceptionally galling because her curfew has not been moved any later, even though she's now 14 rather than 13, which is a huge difference. And all of this is a huge hurdle in her way because she has one goal: to find a mentor to teach her grammatica, the language of magic. And that's no easy feat because part of the peace agreement between the Birdies and Khalifa was that no one in Khalifa is allowed to learn magic anymore. But Flora does have an idea of where to start looking for a mentor. She has two people in mind. The first is a revolutionary who hides his insurrectionist behavior behind a persona of a basically rock star. The second, her backup plan, is her family's biggest political enemy. But she is determined, and no amount of political machinations, boy trouble, confinement, family drama, or giant squid attacks will stand in her way. So if you've seen my review of Flora Segunda, you will remember that I was very enthusiastic about that book. I loved it. It's on my list of my 5 favorite books I've read so far this year. I'm slightly less enthusiastic about this book. Now, don't get me wrong, I still very much enjoyed it. I still think it's a good, unusual, fun, worthwhile read. But I have some qualms about it. My first qualm is about the world of this book. I feel like the first book did a spectacular job of building a solid Spanish and Mesoamerican inspired, vaguely Victorian fantasy world. And this book did do a lot of good work building on that foundation, but there are just a few bits that I don't feel like fit. Early on in this book, Flora and her best friend Udo are going to a club to see a band, and it's so clear that the author wanted us to get punk rock show at a nightclub vibes. There's a mosh pit, for God's sake. And it just doesn't feel like it fits the rest of the world. And I don't necessarily mean literally, like logically. It is explained that like the amplifiers are basically being powered by magic. But that in itself brings up its own questions of like how much magic are the people of Khalifa allowed to do? But my real problem here is just the vibes. It feels like something straight out of the 1970s, 80s, or 90s is literally dropped into what is otherwise a pre-industrial world. Also, just side note here, I'm sorry, I've been to a buttload of punk and rock shows, and nobody moshes before the music starts. That is not a thing. But I also am a bit mad about the progress of the relationship between Flora and Udo. In the first book, I absolutely loved their friendship. They fought, but they supported each other, they were a good contrast to each other, and they clearly respected each other's abilities. I had thought I would be equally happy if they ended up a couple, or if their relationship remained fully platonic. Turns out, no. I'm not okay with either. I'm really annoyed that we're moving towards them being a romantic couple. Partially, it annoys me just because I feel like it's really rare to have two best friends of different genders who don't fall into a romantic relationship. But mainly, my annoyance comes from how the relationship is progressing. They spend the majority of this book fighting, and most of this fighting is clearly Flora being jealous because Udo has a girlfriend. And I'm just so bored of that narrative. People are fully capable of realizing they like each other without there needing to be jealousy as a driving factor. And I love the fact that Udo was, clearly coded as the cooler of the two friends, but neither of them seemed bothered by that. There were no moments of Flora being like, oh, I wish I was as cool as Udo. When she had jealousy, it stemmed from things like, I wish I had as big of a family as Udo. And then this book hits, and it's all Flora being pissed that her cool best friend abandons her to go hang out with his girlfriend. And I'm like, am I reading a Babysitter's Club books here? What the hell? I was expecting better than that. Then there's the questions of tone. I think this book honestly has a tone problem. I talked a bit about it in the review of book 1, but there's a certain childishness to the language that's used in these books. And originally I thought it was Flora, our POV character's voice, but a lot of the characters also use relatively childish terminology. They say things like potty and snapperhead and pig face. And I mean, yeah, these are young adults books. But at first glance, I would guess by word choice them to be aimed at middle grade, and they aren't. I really think they aren't. The text is linguistically complex enough that I would not feel comfortable handing it to just any 5th grader and saying go to town. But also the content is not what I would feel comfortable handing to a 5th grader and going go to town. There's a lot of violence in this book, and some of it is pretty damn graphic. There are some soft cuss words, like pissed, and a lot of imitation cussing, which I don't have a problem with giving to kids, but I know some people do. There's a lot of usage of the word fick instead of fuck. There's a reference to condoms and a question about whether one of the 14-year-old characters is having sex. I'm not entirely sure what age range I would suggest this book to, but I would worry that the childlike language might be putting off whatever age range actually is targeted here. I also want to talk about one particular moment of violence that happens pretty early on in this book. Flora and Udo are, spoiler alert, being chased by outlaws, and Flora decapitates one of them with a spell that she has no idea how she cast. And then this moment is never addressed again in the rest of the damn book. Now, this is not the only time that we see Flora do magic in a sort of instinctual, barely in control of it way, but every other time that I can think of, there's something that's causing it. She picked up a grammatica word, seemingly almost physically at one point. Another point, it's explained that she knows that you can combine 2 grammatica words and use fear basically as a catalyst to create a new spell, and she decides to try that. But this time, somebody has to explain to her what spell she actually did. Udo asks, how did you do that? Flora responds with, I don't know, and that's it. The conversation is dropped, it never comes up again. Even though in the rest of the damn book, it's mentioned multiple times that Flora doesn't know how to use grammatica words that are multisyllable, and this one definitely was multisyllable. So, it's just not making sense there. On top of this, it's never addressed that 14-year-old Flora just killed a man. Now, when I first read this passage, I sort of dismissed it because I was thinking, okay, this book is just a lot more violent than the previous one. And I mean, yeah, there's a scene maybe 20 pages later where she is handling a different dead body and is played for comedic relief. But that is a dead body that neither her nor Udo directly killed, and I don't know, it just seems different. There's also a moment later on in the book, another spoiler here, where Flora accidentally kills somebody who is trying to kill her. But that's treated as a much bigger deal. And partially it makes sense that it's a bigger deal because this is a character that she's actually talked to, she's had conversations with. Like, she could consider this character an acquaintance, versus the one where she kills in the first couple of chapters where literally he said something snide to her and then is dead. So there is different levels of personhood to these characters. But at the same time, I'm not sure I buy the difference in reaction, because the second one, it's treated as like, oh my god, Flora killed someone, oh. And, like, it's not treated as seriously as if, like, you know, a real 14-year-old had killed somebody, but it's a bit serious. So these two facts of this moment not matching up to the rest of the book makes me wonder if, is this a mistake? Is this inconsistency? Or is this meant to be foreshadowing of some greater mystery? And I will admit, like, in retrospect, I lean more towards the second one, especially considering I think I have an idea of what it could be foreshadowing. But I shouldn't be wondering about that. I feel like I should know if it was a mistake or not. But otherwise, I really did enjoy this book. And I was not in a great state of mind when I was reading it, so the fact that I enjoyed it shows a lot of good qualities to the book. There are some twists to it that manage to actually take me by surprise, and yet they are fully supported by the text. Flora is still a fun, interesting mix of actually capable, while still struggling to find herself. I loved the evolution of Poppy in this book. His development felt like it was really adding depth, rather than just rewriting the character, which I feel like is something that often happens when characters change. And I appreciate the fact that Flora's relationships with all of her family have some serious depth. Like, I feel like a lot of times, especially in books aimed at kids, family is either like the happy magic, fun times kind of family, or the abusive bad vibes family. And it's sort of rare to find a book where parents are just treated as flawed but loving human beings. And this book really does manage to create that vibe. Also, for all my problems with the weird voice, it's actually really endearing once you get used to it. The world is still fascinating and complex. I'm still really loving this series. It's just not perfect.